My name is Mac McComas, and I'm the Senior Program Manager at Johns Hopkins 21st Century Cities Initiative and the co-author with Matthew Kahn of the new book, Unlocking the Potential of Post-Industrial Cities. In this new webcast series, we explore themes discussed in our book by diving deep into the history and future of the 6 post-industrial cities of Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis. We look at the ways in which these cities can improve outcomes for people, neighborhoods, and businesses, and how they can attract new residents and investments so that everyone can reach their full potential. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Daniel Webster to discuss gun violence reduction strategies in Baltimore. Daniel Webster is the Bloomberg Professor of American Health at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where among many things, he directs the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Prevention and Policy, which recently celebrated 25 years of field-leading research. Dr. Webster is one of the nation's leading experts on firearm policy and the prevention of gun violence. Hi, Daniel. Thanks for joining me today.
Good to be with you.
So today we're going to talk about some of your research on gun violence in Baltimore. So I know you've done several evaluations of the Safe Streets Cure Violence model in Baltimore. Could you give just a brief overview of what you've learned about its effectiveness and what your known unknowns are at this point, and some of your just big outstanding questions going forward?
Sure. So just to first give a background and understanding of the program and how it's evolved in Baltimore. So Baltimore first started the Safe Streets program in 2 neighborhoods initially, and then it grew to 4 neighborhoods. This goes back to 2007 to 2009, that period. And our first evaluation looked at the efficacy of the program in the first 4 sites with slightly different follow-up periods. But we had roughly 2 years or so of implementation process going on to look at and what those outcomes were. In that first study, we had some encouraging findings. We saw very clear and sizable reductions in homicides and shootings in 2 of the 4 neighborhoods. One of them was McElderry Park in East Baltimore, one was in Cherry Hill in South Baltimore. The other 2 sites were somewhat adjacent to McElderry Park, and there were some peculiarities in the implementation of it. In some respects, it didn't get the full resources that the other 2 were, and that maybe partly explained why we didn't see the beneficial impacts in those communities. And the follow-up period also was shorter in those areas. We also did some anonymous street interviews with youth in those communities. We wanted to get a sense of the mediating factors that the program is supposed to try to impact. Look, the program is trying to reach the highest risk individuals for being shot or committing a shooting, and most immediately try to mediate any conflicts that might lead to a shooting. But they're also, of course, trying to be positive role models and start to shift social norms within those communities so that when there is a conflict or someone is, provoking someone in some way, that there are a response to those situations other than with a gun. And in that community surveys, what we found pretty stunning, and I have to say I was a little surprised, beneficial effects on what we would refer to as social norms or attitudes. We presented a range of scenarios to individuals and basically said, do you think this is justifiable to respond to those situations with a gun or not? And generally, we did see some program effects in comparison to other neighborhoods that didn't get the intervention. So there's a lot to feel good about. We also interviewed participants, the people who engaged with the outreach team the most, and learned that they were really having a positive impact on many of the individuals they were engaging with. So there was a lot to feel good about. Now, our most recent published evaluation was in 2018, where we had a lot more data, a lot more sites. We looked at 7 sites over that span. It's worth noting that there was also one other site that never really fully got off the ground, and we didn't include that in our evaluation. But in that more recent evaluation, we failed to see clear beneficial effects on shootings and homicides. And there were at least one community, possibly 2 communities, where there were actually increases in gun violence. I think I have some understanding of why we saw potentially harmful impacts in those areas. I don't think it was likely to be due to the program itself. It had to do with certain timing of events. One of the program sites was Mondamin, which was literally ground zero for the uprising or riots that took place in 2015, and the implementation of that program overlapped with basically everything going crazy in that area. But generally, the takeaway is that some of the early beneficial effects that we saw in our first evaluation had eroded over time. One theory, I guess, or that I have is that while we often, or it's often portrayed as these community interventions as alternative to law enforcement responses to gun violence, I think in many ways we should think of them as complements rather than substitutes for police. When the program was having its greatest impacts in the earlier days is also, frankly, when I think our law enforcement was most focused and actually effective in focusing on violent individuals with guns. And conversely, when we looked in the, you can refer to as the post-Freddie Gray era, things changed literally overnight after the uprising there, where we had roughly a 70% increase in gun violence. It's been very, very hard to do the violence prevention street level work when there's so little trust in law enforcement. So again, my main takeaway from what we've learned about Safe Streets is that it can be very effective when the law enforcement is also effective, but its effectiveness can wane if law enforcement is both ineffective and seen as illegitimate.
So, building on that point of effective crime reduction strategies relying on coordination across different entities, looking beyond Safe Streets and sort of maybe just sort of more broadly. At the local level, looking across multiple government agencies, community-based organizations, philanthropy, the private sector, there are all these individuals that have some level of involvement in violent crime reduction. Given, sort of all these players, what partnerships do you think could be strengthened in Baltimore that have either seen some promise in the city or promising models that exist in other cities?
Yeah, it's a great question. My short answer is all of them. Generally, when you're seeing cities be effective in, significantly reducing gun violence, the common theme is cooperation and coordination. That people are working as true partners. They recognize this is a really big and complicated problem, you cannot address it just with aggressive law enforcement. You shouldn't address it at all with aggressive law enforcement, but very focused law enforcement and effective. And even that component, the law enforcement component, really requires close collaboration, coordination between police and prosecutors. Most importantly, state prosecutors, but also at the federal level as well. People have to be on the same page. What is the overall strategy that we're going to take in order to address, one of the biggest social problems facing cities like Baltimore? So law enforcement partners need to be on the same page on their strategy. But it also needs to be in conjunction with social service providers, community groups, and other entities that should be partners producing public safety. So the type of strategy that I think brings all of these threads together the best is, it goes by different names. The name being used right now in Baltimore is Group Violence Reduction Strategy. People in criminology circles sometimes refer to it as focused deterrence. Also goes by group violence intervention. But the basics is that it is very focused. It is data driven, because what we know about gun violence in city after city is that it's a very small number of individuals, often in a relatively small number of places. And you have to identify the individuals and groups who are driving the violence and change those behaviors. You change those behaviors not by one thing, but by a coordinated strategy that most importantly draws the line and say, we are no longer going to tolerate gun violence, these high levels of loss of life and trauma. When I say we, the importance is the we is not someone just with a badge or a prosecutor. It is a unified message to the individuals most involved with the problem, coming from the community as well, with message not you are bad people, but simply what you're doing is harming yourself, your family, and your community, and it has to stop. And we're going to help you. And you can think of it as a set of promises. The law enforcement is saying, we are promising that we are going to be fair, but we also are not going to tolerate gun violence. If there is gun violence, expect a response. The other promises is promises of help, promise for social services, assistance with getting jobs, housing, mental health support, substance abuse treatment. Many of the individuals who are at highest risk for being involved in violence have a range of unmet needs that drives incredibly risky behavior. So the intervention is designed to really be coordinated, be focused, deliver on your promises. And so all of these pieces are relevant, and including that community message that we're not going to tolerate the violence, and frankly, we care about you. It's sort of a mushy kind of thing, but it actually matters. People, young men principally, who are engaged in this kind of activity, don't really respond well to threats. They respond a lot better to supportive messages. So anyway, that's the essence of the strategy, and it's worked well in many cities. It can look very different, I have to say, and so the importance in all of this is to really get it right, implement it correctly.
Yeah, and I saw, I think it was just earlier this week, a youth outreach organization was awarded some funding to do that work and be one of the partners sort of in this collaborative effort. And I know, this strategy has been pursued in Baltimore in the past at sort of, different levels, and it seems like, from my understanding of it, is that there was just both a lack of collaboration and buy-in, but just, it didn't seem that it was the right political moment for it to work. And I know we're sort of in the early days of it being adopted and embraced in Baltimore, but do you see this as a sort of more momentous time for this, that there's greater potential for it to work?
Absolutely. We've studied at least the most recent iteration of this strategy, and the implementation was very different from what is rolling out now, what is being planned. The last iteration literally had no resources to actually help people. It was mostly, in my mind, a repeat of a same old, let's arrest a lot of people strategy. And so it clearly cannot and will not look that way when it is rolled out in Baltimore now. You have a mayor, a police commissioner, and I would also say a state's attorney, who are all committed to reforms so that law enforcement is focused on violence, and otherwise is going to work in unison with community partners, basically, again, in a effort to change behavior. So resources are on the table to provide help rather than just arrest. And there is a plan underway also for community engagement to bring people on board, because it's the part of the strategy that seems a little mushy, but I actually think it's pretty important, because law enforcement only engages with these individuals a limited number of times. What the individuals at high risk really need is they need that more constant messages from people around them to support them going in a direction away from violence.
Agreed. So turning to crime strategies, to violent crime reduction strategies that don't work, I think it was in your 2018 or 2019 report where you had some interesting findings looking at drug law enforcement arrests that might have actually increased crime. Could you explain how some of these strategies to take down drug dealing organizations might have actually resulted in increased crime rather than decreased crime?
Yeah, so I have to say it's a bit of a complex picture, but I'll try to unravel what we found and at least how I interpret our findings. What we found is that a common approach of simply making a lot of drug arrests as a strategy for suppressing gun violence frankly did not work in Baltimore, and our data suggests that in all likelihood was counterproductive. So we use one measure of what we called surges in gun arrests. These were sort of unusual volume of drug-related arrests in a given month in a given police post. That was our proxy for neighborhoods, which is pretty close. And what we found is that when you had a surge of drug arrests, let's say in April, the most common response was that in May and June and July and some numbers of months following, you were going to get unusually or higher levels of violence than would have been forecast otherwise, rather than lower levels. And that persisted for at least 9 months after this so-called surge in drug arrest. My interpretation of that, and I have spent some time, doing focus groups with various people, connected to this stuff, is that these efforts simply disrupt a drug market in ways that probably lead to resolutions that more commonly use guns to resolve them. So it's instability in the markets that tend to prompt violence. And if you're going to take out a group of individuals selling drugs in an area, there's simply going to be more competition within that area. And there's also potentially repercussions within the group that is selling drugs if they don't want somebody to roll on somebody else. Now, here's the other interesting thing that we found is that what we call major bust of drug organizations that typically were part of a more long-term investigative process and often involving federal partners as well. And these were activities that were driven principally by violence. They were trying to not say we're going to arrest everybody in a given area, but they were really trying to identify the individuals and groups who were driving the violence. These major drug busts, converse to the just a lot of arrests, the ones that were more coordinated strategies, we actually found to have a violence suppressing effect, again, that lasted for roughly 9 months or so. I think the takeaway from this for me is that we can certainly do with a lot fewer drug arrests and certainly not be harmed by that. But in some cases, it is beneficial to public safety to apply these drug laws against people who are the most violent and driving violence in an area. That's my overall takeaway from what we learned.
Thanks. Yeah, I just found that so interesting, and especially a point I think you make that researchers have not really given this issue a whole lot of attention. So I think there's, to your point, still a lot of work that can be done here.
Yeah, it's rather stunning. I have to say that it's changing now, but recent decades, the amount of resources devoted to drug law enforcement and the amount of research that really examines closely what the impacts of that is stunningly minimal.
Yeah, you'd think different. So now turning to the state level,
Mm-hmm.
Maryland is known for having relatively strict gun laws among U.S. states. But many of Maryland's neighboring states have less restrictive laws. So how serious of an issue is gun trafficking across state borders as it relates to violence in Baltimore and sort of the proliferation of guns in the city? And if it is a serious issue, what additional coordination is needed across states and between sort of local, state, and federal government to start to stem this tide?
Yeah, great question. So in 2013, Maryland started to adopt some of these stricter gun laws, and importantly, based upon our research, licensing requirements for people purchasing handguns was really key. There were some other important measures adopted as well, with better oversight of gun dealers and requirements to report lost or stolen guns. But following what it was called the Firearm Safety Act of 2013, we saw two things that were positive. One is that the flow of guns after a retail sale in Maryland to criminal use really greatly declined, particularly in Baltimore. Of course, a lot of things changed in late April of 2015 that we already talked about with the uprising. But clearly there was some beneficial effect in the law was doing exactly what it was designed to do, which was have fewer guns moved from legal sale to illegal use in Maryland. We did see proportionately more of the guns recovered by police and from criminal suspects and crime scenes that were originating from out of state. This is something, frankly, that is predictable in state gun laws. Many people will interpret that as, well, what's the point if they're just going to get a gun from another state? It's not exactly how I think about it, because what we've learned is that if a state or a city has a large proportion of the guns that are used in crime coming from out of state, what that means is there's some degree of local scarcity. The price has risen because of the local supply constraints. People have studied underground gun markets, myself included, and my colleagues have learned. In any city, you would do such a study. You would far prefer to go down the street than across state lines or risk exposure to federal gun charges for bringing guns across state lines. So there is a cost, and we've actually surveyed people on parole and probation and found that they say, yeah, it's harder to get guns now than it used to be. So that's good. Nevertheless, you still have to address the interstate gun trafficking problem. And we in Baltimore are going to be more reliant upon partnerships with the ATF and entities in the supplying states. And the states of greatest concern are Virginia and West Virginia. So certainly in Northern Virginia, there is an appreciation that the same kind of people who are trafficking guns to Baltimore probably are doing that in Washington, D.C., or even in Northern Virginia as well. So there really can and needs to be a regional coordination to address this. And this has been done to varying degrees in different places. One study is now a little bit old now, but work in Massachusetts that was mostly focused on gun violence in Boston at the time. Actually, while they were doing the focused deterrence intervention, they were also addressing the supply side simultaneously. And the two combined were really quite effective, and that they did indeed, based upon the gun trace data, show a noteworthy reduction in trafficking cases when there was a coordinated initiative to focus on it, again, in a very data-driven way, so that you're using the scarce law enforcement resources appropriately.
So going back to the local level and thinking about policy changes, back in 2017, Baltimore had a pretty comprehensive rewrite of its zoning code. And one of the things that they did was zone out some alcohol outlets that were sort of grandfathered into residential neighborhoods. And I know you've and some of your colleagues at Hopkins have done some research on the connection between alcohol outlet density and violent crime in neighborhoods. And so I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about what you found, how you think zoning could be a useful tool for reducing crime in cities, and if there's any concern that if you shut down some of these alcohol outlets, that they then become vacant stores and you sort of get other associated problems.
Yeah, great question. So the connection between alcohol and violence is underappreciated. It does play an important role in violent crime in Baltimore and virtually all communities. both domestic violence and what we would refer to as community or street violence. There's a very robust research literature very consistently showing that the density of alcohol outlets, there is a positive association in essence between the density of alcohol outlets in an area and how much violent crime there is, including gun violence. We've done some of that work in Baltimore, but again, it's remarkably consistent across other cities. One of the things we looked at is outlets in more residential neighborhoods, and we did find a harmful effect of having outlets that not that were part of a restaurant or place serving food and things like that, but we're now talking more liquor store kind of outlets in residential neighborhoods, that this was correlated with higher rates of gun violence in Baltimore, and that we projected that you could reduce gun violence to some degree by, again, zoning practices, so that you would zone out these outlets from residential neighborhoods. I have to say that the more robust and bigger finding, in my opinion, is simply the overall number of outlets was really important, and that in many ways the bigger issue for Baltimore is that we have way more alcohol outlets than we should. We have roughly the same number of outlets that we did when we had a much larger population. And the other thing is that, like everything in Baltimore, there is great racial disparities in where those outlets are. So the communities that are being harmed by the alcohol oversupply of alcohol outlets are predominantly poor African American communities. So Baltimore could greatly reduce violent crime by simply having fewer alcohol outlets. That's a harder political move, but I feel like it's worth putting that out there. Now, you raised the question of, okay, if these alcohol outlets, let's say you take those licenses away, for example, what happens? Do you have simply less commerce and less businesses? Because some of those places that sell alcohol sell other things that in communities that where simply getting food, a loaf of bread, or carton of something is hard to find. What would happen? Would there be? That's a hard thing to predict. I haven't studied. If you have fewer alcohol outlets, and presumably you also have other good violent crime reduction strategies, that will allow better environments for businesses to thrive and have safer, healthier communities.
Yeah, and I think I know some of these licenses are sort of in the early days of being taken away, so it's kind of a little bit too early to know the effects. But in a neighborhood near me in Baltimore, one of these liquor stores closed down, and now it's Motzi Bakery, this really great local bakery, and so it's there's obviously a whole lot of potential that these could be turned into businesses that are very positive for the neighborhoods where they're located.
Yeah, I'm reasonably optimistic that that would be the case. You know, the idea of social disorder and physical disorder in neighborhoods is something been studied very well, and its connection to violent crime is a very close connection. But what's most remarkable about all the metrics and looking at social and physical disorder is how closely alcohol is tied to that. The alcohol environment of, frankly, a lot of alcohol abuse in those neighborhoods really changes so much about the social fabric in a neighborhood in very unhealthy ways. So if you can start to turn that around, it really changes the whole dynamic of a neighborhood, and allows, again, for businesses and other things to thrive and create healthier environments.
Yeah. So turning to sort of the personal level, I wanted to make sure that we talked about behavioral interventions, in particular cognitive behavioral therapy. And I know Jens Ludwig in Chicago has studied the Becoming a Man program there and showed that it can have quite the impact and be very cost effective. And I know you know, there are similar aspects of some of that program going on in Baltimore, but I was wondering if you could just speak to sort of some of the evidence of success of these programs, why they're successful, and you know, if there's anything we could do to sort of ramp these programs up in the city.
Sure. So, so what I'll say about that is that something that researchers studying violence in all of its forms have found is that to an important degree, violence is a result of cognitive processes that you could say are faulty. You could also say they adapt to the environmental conditions in which the person is. But basically, if you take the same sort of social stimuli, you can interpret and respond to that stimuli in multiple ways, some of which would very predictably lead to violent actions and some not. And in order to change behavior, you almost always have to change thinking. And there is, you know, something called cognitive behavioral therapy that, and cognitive behavioral theory, a broader idea of behavioral change, that has shown to work to reduce aggressive and violent behavior in a lot of different contexts. So it's definitely an important tool that we should use with individuals. You mentioned the Becoming a Man intervention in Chicago, very impressive results. There's other studies with other populations also showing impressive results. In Baltimore, one of the programs working with the highest risk, particularly young people, is ROCA. And ROCA is a program that relies very heavily upon cognitive behavioral theory to help create change in high-risk individuals, and have pretty impressive ways to promote this change and make it relevant these individuals that they're working with, the young individuals they're working with. I have to say, though, that even though there's a really good track record of applications of cognitive behavioral therapy or theory to reducing violent behavior, with the highest risk individuals for gun violence, I'm still waiting to see a little more evidence of efficacy. including with ROCA, even though I'm very impressed with it and the brain science underlying it. To me, I think when I think about the problem, I think it has to be done in combination with, in essence, environmental change conditions. If you're trying to train people to respond differently, but everything around them is the same sort of environment that promotes violence, and you're trying to promote a different response in those conditions, when some of the, if you took guns out of the picture, it would be easier to create that change. But if people feel that, wow, if I buy into this way of interpreting social stimuli, but the guy next to me doesn't, and he pulls out a gun and shoots me, well, what good does that do me? You know what I mean? So I do think it should be thought of as a component of gun violence prevention, but I'm still waiting to see whether, in and of itself, without these other changes, it will reduce gun violence. The metrics in Becoming a Man and many of the other studies are just violent crimes or violent behavior generally. Often that doesn't involve guns. I do think guns change a lot of things, and that's it's one of the reasons I focus on guns, because I think it is if you don't address guns, it's so much more challenging to change individual behavior, whether it's through violence interruption work from safe streets, or whether it's cognitive behavioral theory being applied by ROCA. I think if you don't simultaneously focus on the accessibility of guns and that component, I think all of this gets very challenging. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense to me. And I think that's a perfect point to end on. So I want to thank you for taking the time. I certainly learned a lot, and thanks for focusing on these important issues in Baltimore.
Well, thank you.